I've heard so many people say that haze gives an image more depth. Obviously, you can use it for volumetric light, but when you're not in that specific use case, what benefit does it actually give you? Well, it's actually really simple. I just never had it explained to me in a way that clicked for me until I was watching the documentary film Navalny. They kept coming back to the same A-roll shot of the main character, and I thought it looked so damn good. And every time they cut back to it, I would try to dissect, like, what is it about this that I love so much? There's some cool practicals in frame and some nice color contrast, but that wasn't it. And then finally it hit me. Because there's haze in the background, the black levels behind him are being lifted. And therefore, in this dark bar, he is actually the darkest thing in frame, making him pop from the background and appear more three-dimensional. Think about that for a second. There are clearly film lights exposing this guy, but yet he is still the darkest thing in this space, which is a dark bar, because the haze is behind him, absorbing all of that practical light from those fixtures in the room, which I can prove by adding a Luma key and then slowly removing all of the highlights until we're just left with the darkest area in the frame, which you can see mostly is him. So I found this very interesting, but also not very actionable, because I thought, in that example, they're in a huge space with tons of depth, so they're able to keep that haze separated from their subject. And I was worried that if I tried to implement this technique in one of my own shoots, I would risk getting the haze in front of the subject, lifting their black levels, and end up with an overall milky image. But I was wrong. I only really half understood this concept. It really fully clicked for me when I, oddly enough, was watching this hour-long YouTube video about the history of technology in broadcasting the NFL. And this revelation came when they were discussing the Skycam. They gave an anecdote about an extremely foggy day in New England that was very hard to capture with traditional telephoto lenses.
The fog is so thick, so most of what you see will be from below.
It seems so obvious in hindsight now, but it really took this clip to drive it home for me. The farther your subject is from the camera, the more haze the lens will be shooting through, and therefore the stronger the effect the haze will have. Typically, your subject isn't that far away from your camera, and that's why I was wrong about the other interview example. It's not that their location allowed them to keep the haze completely separated from their subject. It's because the background is so much farther away from the camera than the interview subject. And this concept should work in any size space. The haze is not localized behind me in this tiny office. It is everywhere. But I should be affected less by the haze because I am half the distance to the camera, roughly. And this effect would be far greater if I was in a large room and not an office that's like 100 square feet. But even in a small space like this, I think the haze has settled enough now where you can tell that I am now both the brightest and the darkest thing in frame, and the blacks in my tripod bag and my aperture bags and my easy rig bags. The level on those has been brought up because the camera is going through more haze. Let's do a good old-fashioned wipe and you can really see the before and after. Look at how lifted those blacks are in the background. The contrast on me, you can see if I wipe it back, will barely change because the camera isn't traveling through that much haze to get to me compared to the background. For a handful of shoots in the past, I have rented or borrowed haze machines, most often actually like cheap fog machines from friends for music videos and stuff like that when I wanted to achieve specifically volumetric light, but this type of application is all new to me. So once I picked one up, I naturally ran a ton of tests in my apartment to wrap my head around how the haze will react in various lighting conditions. But before all of that, I need to thank the sponsor of today's video, Artlist. Artlist is where I found all of the funky tracks for this video, as well as 98% of the music for my YouTube channel over the past 3 or 4 years. And it's very convenient to just put in your YouTube channel and not get any copyright strikes. It's very simple. You don't have to tell Artlist every time you use one of their tracks. Everything is pre-licensed, so personally I've never had an issue with a strike coming from Artlist. I've had tons of strikes when I work with musicians and then their music is copyrighted and then it gets flagged in my videos, but with Artlist that's never been a problem. And as a freelancer, I've used their music and sound effects in the vast majority of my client projects over the last 3 or 4 years as well. And they probably think it costs me a lot more than it actually does to get this caliber of music for their videos, whether that's for the web or occasionally for broadcast. Artlist is so affordable because this subscription is less than $20 a month, which gives me all major genres of music and sound effects. You can also lump together music, sound effects, and stock footage if you need it into the Artlist Max plan. And the stock footage on Artlist doesn't feel as stock as you would expect it to at this incredibly affordable price point. And if for any reason you decide to cancel your subscription, you can still leave those videos live and continue making money on them as long as they were posted while the subscription was still active. And you can get 2 free months when purchasing any annual plan by using the link in my description. Thank you, Artlist, for sponsoring this portion of the video. Now let's fade back in that funky track, and I'm gonna get back to the video where I was telling you about the 3 lessons I had from testing out my new HAZER. First, it does not matter how much physical depth you have in your scene if there is no light for that haze to absorb. So back in that documentary example, there were very deep shadows, but there was enough ambient light coming in through the windows and from the practicals to illuminate the haze in those shadows. So in this test here, where I'm shooting down a hallway into another room with a very dim light, if I add haze, there's barely a difference in the background. My black shirt is still the same level as the deep background, and there's basically no separation between my shoulder and the dark hallway. So if I were to add more light to that far room, and then add some haze, you can tell that the haze is having more of an effect, specifically with the windows on that door. Because it's dark outside, those are basically reading as pure black without the haze. But with the haze, the ambient light from around those windows is absorbed by the haze, and we're shooting through it from a long distance. And the way that the distance naturally increases the strength of the haze makes it so that my shoulder and the deep background will never be the same luminance level and therefore have greater separation. Whereas the same level of black in the deep background as on my shoulder could read as kind of busy in frame without the haze. Second, the haze doesn't just absorb the luminance from the light, it will also absorb the color from the light. You can see these 3 spikes in the waveform, 1, 2, 3, which are coming from those 3 practical lights in frame. You can tell that the one on the far right has that blue to the side of it. That is because the light on the right is bouncing off the wall, casting that teal, which is being reflected in the waveform. Now what if we add some haze? Now the middle spike has a blue halo around it because the haze is absorbing that color. This is something that I originally came across when shooting a music video a couple years ago. We were using some green practicals, and then for the climax of the video, when we added some fog, everything turned green. You can see on the right, without the haze, blacks are black and green is green. But once you add the haze, everything just kind of takes on that color. During some of these tests, I thought that the haze looked a little reminiscent of a mist filter, which a lot of people would use to create blooming around hard light sources. So I ran a quick test on my black mist filter compared to the haze. First off, we're starting with a clean shot, no filtration or atmosphere. Now I'm going to the 1/8 black mist filter, and now to the haze. And you can see that the effect of the mist filter is staying closer to the light source, pretty much just affecting that highlight, whereas the haze obviously has an effect over the entire image. In this case, doing what we were talking about earlier with the documentary interview, where the background is nearly black in some areas and lifting up those levels to create a lot of contrast with our subject, in this case the lens, which now becomes the darkest thing in frame.